Hi, everyone. March 10. March 10. Alan Watt has passed away. Alan Watt. I was rather shocked to see those comments underneath one of my videos. Here, this is his website, by the way. Alan Watt. Our hearts are broken. We grieve the loss of Alan Watt, who left this world on 4 March 2021. 6 days ago, he died. His tireless work to share his knowledge of the system we are born into and how it has wrought the horrors we are living through now is his priceless gift to us. And hear this: truth is eternal and cannot be compromised. Hearing and understanding truth leaves one with a dilemma, for it demands change, beginning with you, and even your closest relationships may go down the drain. Yet, that is the price demanded in the past, today, and for always. The truth is extremely demanding. We are spirits descended into matter for a purpose. Understanding this is the meaning of the term having life and having it more abundantly. This does not mean accumulation of products. It means doing that which is true. Truth is eternal. It cannot alter. And only truth will make you free. Quote from Cutting Through, Volume 1, Alan Watt. This man taught an awful lot of us about this crazy world that we are living in. I mean, every subject that you can think of, he had researched and could speak eloquently on those subjects. And whether you have listened to Alan Watt or read any of his books or articles, or you were listening to somebody else, their knowledge that they got from Alan Watt, he touched all of our lives. Now, he was not, I believe he was younger than I am. Maybe 54, 55. That's my understanding. I could be wrong. But no, I've looked, I've searched. I cannot find any information on how he died. What happened? Just that he died. I'd like to know how, why, what happened. Cutting Through the Matrix, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. The Androgynous Agenda. A Glimpse into the Great Work. Esoteric Unveiled, and the Meaning of Revelations in the High Masonic Tradition. This is a big, big loss. And I'm really surprised that when I received the comments, when I read the comments under my video, I put in the search bar, YouTube, Alan Watt died. And I only found one video on it. One. And that was, Cutting Through the Matrix. No, I'm sorry. Reality Bites Radio. It was posted on Alan Watts' channel. Nobody else? Does anybody even know? Let's just say, these are not terms that I'm generally fond of using, but he was a giant in this community of ours. I learned a lot from him. So thank you, Alan, very much. And I am really sad that you are no longer with us. I want to play some of his interview. And there's a lot of videos here. We live in an artificial system. I went back, I did the sort by oldest. And I was just looking through these videos. Some of these videos I've, throughout the years, have heard. Psychological warfare. I mean, the subjects that he was just so knowledgeable. The research that this man did was phenomenal. I mean, just Tavistock, Frankfurt, Fabian Society, Skinner, Pavlov, psychology, spirituality, New Age, the New Age, and how it began, Albert Pike, the Masons, all the agendas, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and the dumbing down of society, weather modification, propaganda, technology, everything. Well, it's really, man, this man was so right on and very knowledgeable about everything. Everything that has been happening, that is now happening. And now he's gone. It's a wonder, this life. And he also spoke about how, life will, it will just become something insignificant. And that has come to pass. It's come to pass. Brilliant work. And I have to ask this, does anybody care? Do we really care? Let's start taking off the shackles. So the official website of Alan Watt will be maintained and updated going forward. And this is all we get. Well, if anybody has any knowledge about how this man died, please leave a comment below. Anyway, sorry, I more frequently do I think about life and the point of it. We're here and then we're gone, and some of us leave behind people who are heartbroken and sad, and some just are here and then they're gone, and that's it. It's a strange thing. Anyway, I will link below to his channel, to his site, and let me find, here it is. I'll play just a little bit of this interview that he gave back in 2014, July 31. And then I'll link to it below, and you can listen to the end of it. And those of you who are kind of just out of the gate, you might want to listen to Alan Watt. Yeah.
Welcome back to the Power Hour radio show. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 8 minutes past the hour, moving into the second hour of the broadcast today. And I personally am just very, very excited to be getting an opportunity to speak with Alan Watt again. He's agreed to come back on the show. Last time he was on the show, we had such a positive response, so many questions. Just his ability to convey information about such a wide variety of topics is just second to none. He's been an integral part in my awakening process, and I'm really happy to be able to share some of his information with you folks today. And just to give you some background on Alan, he has been a researcher of the causative forces behind all of the major changes in historical development for a number of years. He's sort of a Renaissance man. He was a musician. He's been an author. He does speeches on radio and does video just all the time. He's got a fantastic website called Cutting Through the Matrix, and I recommend everybody go there. But again, you're going to hear some information today that you're not going to hear anyplace else, and this is what the Power Hour is all about. So, Mr. Watt, thank you so much for agreeing to come back on to the Power Hour again today.
It's a pleasure to be back on, yeah.
Well, it's going to be a pleasure to speak with you. Before we get too in-depth, I want to preface everything by saying we're going to talk about social engineering today. We're going to talk about mind control, some of the techniques and agendas and technologies that are used to manipulate people, manipulate the masses, and talk about that from a historical perspective and try and do some projection onto the future to see where we're all going. But before we get into that, Alan, could you give us just a little bit more of your background, talk to the people about who you are, just for new listeners, people who may not be familiar with you?
Yes, I've been studying this since I was a child, really. I had to know why things were changing so rapidly in Britain, especially where I was born. And we had fantastic libraries there. And I managed even to get into the adult library when I was very young. So I got access to lots of reference books going back hundreds of years, some of them, to see the causative forces even back in history. And I realized even at school that the current histories we were having of the past were fake, they were false, they'd been changed, when the original books that were written at the time had vastly different informations in them and so on. So I caught on rather quickly that society always has, for each generation, its new reality, you might say, given to them, beginning especially with school. And that carries on to the parents, who then teach that new reality on to the child. So it's an ongoing system that's been well understood for many centuries, in fact, of how reality is given. I realized, too, that countries like Britain, now it's the US, of course, used to be the battering ram for what was called from the days of John Dee, for instance, a British world empire. That was eventually turned over to the US when Britain had fought enough of it, taken over a good part of the world, but was technically broke through taxation, and they passed that on to the US to take over around World War I. And Rudyard Kipling, for instance, and others wrote about that. They belonged to the societies which were the driving forces behind that. The Fabian Society, which is a branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and also the Alfred Milner Group, Cecil Rhodes Foundation, and the Council on Foreign Relations. These are all one group today that really make the policies for the world to bring in a world order, literally a standardized world order with a universal culture. All diverse cultures eventually have to be eliminated and changed into this universal culture, but not just for peace on the planet. It's to create a more pliable population worldwide for an elite to rule over and direct much more easily than they have in the past, to do with even the possibility of any future rebellions. In fact, many of the big players who gave us our present culture that we're of today and of the recent past and the culture still to come, the changes still to come, guys who are dead, like Lord Bertrand Russell, for instance, wrote copiously about this because he was a big player along with many behaviorists like Skinner. You've heard of Skinner, the behaviorist, and his brother Julian Huxley, the head of UNESCO. The United Nations was to be a big part of it, and eventually they were to start creating policies that would bypass governmental discussion. That was done long ago. Government today is simply a technocratic government that does what it's told, and it's a big machine, you might say, with its policies already set in place. And the politicians are there to keep us under the illusion that we still have some say in something. But in reality, we've had no say in anything since at least World War II. So a uniform culture, a dumbed-down culture, by the way, population reduction, which would be done insidiously, not through... after all, if they wanted population reduction, they don't ask for volunteers. Who's going to volunteer? And so they simply had their meetings at the end of World War II in London. In fact, the King had a world meeting about it, and they decided that they would go the way of inoculations, the alteration of the food, etc., that would shorten people's lives, make them sicker, and they'd die off quicker. But they also wanted to dumb down the population. They talked about the scientific techniques of mind control in a very big way. They understood it very, very well back then, by the way, and how they could give us realities. They also wanted to break the old system of traditional families. In fact, what was amazing about it all, really, to me, long, long ago, was how the elite who run a good part of the world back then used the Communist Manifesto to help bring in these changes. They wanted to break traditional families and the traditional culture passed from family through generations to make everyone basically susceptible to government authority, as opposed to familial and neighborhood, almost tribal authority, because their biggest problem used to be the family unit. Families had so much in common with other families in their areas, especially in the States. Eventually, previous to that, it was Britain, and people would stand up together when their values were challenged by the authorities. The occasional rebellion would break out, so they had to stop that. H.G. Wells talked about it. He belonged to the Fabian Society, how they would do it. And also you had George Orwell, who understood this perfectly well because he also attended the world meetings they had at the time. He was part of it initially, and he knew what they were going to do to destroy the family culture. And so in this book, 1984, in that particular book, he showed you a world where there was really no family. Everyone was observed night and day by Big Brother through cameras, etc., and listened to with secret microphones. And the government could then talk right down to you. And when they came after you, there's no family or anybody to stand up beside you in your defense. You're on your own. And that in itself is a tremendous psychological weapon, because when you're on your own, you're helpless, you're terrified, and so on. That's what they wanted to do. They're bringing it in today, not through threatening you, but by making it very appealing to give up all freedoms and rights, by giving you all the freebie entertainment and so on through cell phones and electronic media, so you become compliant. You give up voluntarily without even knowing you're doing it or caring, actually. And that's the way that they've gone. So we're pretty well where they want us to be for this particular stage before they bring in the transhumanist agenda completely. Right now, they've muddied up what man and woman was and marriage was. Now we're told to accept all the political correct updates to our programming. And so we have all kinds of genders in between, supposedly. And once you start to believe that, then they can bring forth the actual new creations of different kinds of humans to serve the elite in the future better as we all die off, basically. It's a well-run agenda, and they have constant meetings all year round, world meetings with top scientists about this. So it's ongoing. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you brought up the breakup of the family unit. I mean, we talked about the creation of a uniform culture, the dumbing down of people, the population reductions. Now, these are all aspects of social engineering. I'm curious about when the first instance of social engineering really was, who kind of got this ball rolling, so to speak. And the reason I'm glad you brought up the breakup of the family unit is because we had a guest on, Leslie Abbey, yesterday, who had a video called Buffalo Nation, which was looking at the Lakota Sioux, and this was a fantastic kind of a spotlight put on a small sect of our population here in the country, where a clear agenda was driven in the late 1800s, where they separated the Native Americans from their families, and they actually said, it was to completely dissolve their tradition, to make them not able to be a family anymore. And I think that that's a really salient point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because we see evidence of it all around us. But if we could get back on the subject of the birth of this social engineering, and just maybe give a broader definition of social engineering for anybody who may not understand what it looks like as an agenda, if you could, sir.
Well, social engineering begins with this, first of all, even in ancient times, by the way. This was done occasionally by different people in Persia, countries they conquered, where you'd separate the child from the parent, basically. And you'd indoctrinate them with a new philosophy, and so the children would turn against their parents. They even have bits of that in the Bible, of course, because it's been done before. And it's not a new thing at all. We saw the same thing in the communist revolution, where children were taught a whole new philosophy of life, and they're taught to actually hate their parents as being obsolete and actually nasty to the progress of society as a whole. So,
Alan,
it's
I've got to interrupt
old.
you, and I apologize. I have to interrupt. We've got to take a 4-minute break. We're going to come back. I'm going to ask Alan about psychiatry and the new normal. We're going to talk more about mind control techniques and technologies being used for that going forward in the future. Keep it right here with Alan Watt. My name is J.D. Moore. I'm with Joyce Riley. This is the Power Hour Radio Show. We'll be back in 4 minutes with Mr. Alan Watt. Keep it here. Show, ladies and gentlemen. It is 24 minutes past the hour. We are picking up our discussion with Mr. Alan Watt. The website of interest for you today is cuttingthroughthematrix.com. There is so much information on there. I totally recommend everyone going and checking out the deprogramming videos, because, as I said, Alan has been an integral part in my awakening process. And we're discussing today social engineering. Before the break, we had started to talk about the history of the agenda. And if Alan, if you want to just pick it up right there, we'll go through the history, and then I want to start talking about some of the technology that is available today that they're using against us.
Yes, you'll find that they really went into big time in the 60s. That's when they really launched the full-scale attack, you might say, to separate the generation from another generation, the new youth generation, their generation. The song came out, in fact, talking about my generation, to make you think that we were a different species almost, and that everything else was obsolete. And they were very successful in that. Big money went into promoting Bob Dylan, of course, who actually was guided by the Communist Party at the time. And they'd already tried to get a lot of blacks in the U.S. to have a revolution, but they were funding them through the Communist Party. The White House is well aware of it too, and it failed. They couldn't get it going, so they decided to change it to the sexual revolution, and use Bob Dylan, especially in the U.S., to get that going. Lay Lady Lay, Across My Big Brass Bed, etc. In the UK, at the same time, with the same kind of deep Southern accent from people who didn't even live there. You had Mick Jagger was brought out to do his Little Red Rooster stuff and all that. And the sexual generation was to take off along with drugs at the same time. The Grateful Dead were put out into the US with Brandt and other people behind them to create this new culture and dishing out free LSD at the time all over the place. And that was to be the call for the break between one generation to the next, and then they'd reprogram this generation with a brand new culture, which they actually did, in fact, where anything goes. So it was awfully successful right to the present day. That killed a few birds with one stone, because out of that came massive unwanted pregnancies, which led to the demand for abortion clinics, which they wanted to depopulate. The idea, too, was to separate the sexual act from the bonding act that goes with it naturally. And they were awfully successful in that, too. They wrote about that from the Frankfurt School, a big player in all of this. And the Frankfurt School was working directly under the authority of the White House to bring in this new culture, by the way, for those who don't know that. So massive things were happening, and they were getting people ready for a different kind of life, post-prosperity. Austerity, you might call it today, was started back then as they tried to dematerialize the people to live simply and cheaply and be a better workforce, working for less money and so on. That's what you have going on the go today under the guise of post-consumerism and austerity. That's also, by the way, why they hit at this particular time when the economy is plummeting. They brought in Obamacare. Most folk, as we know, live to their income level. They spend what they get, and that kept the U.S. going for a long time. But now with $600 to $800 a month Obamacare for a single person, their spending money is gone, and shops and everybody's suffering for that too. But the indoctrination doesn't stop there. You can go back to the days of Marshall McLuhan, for instance, who was Canadian, and he talked about this coming era. He foresaw it in many ways. He saw that eventually most folk could be weaned away from talking to each other directly and influenced and talk to people on the ether, as he called it, the Ethernet, long before you had the internet. But he also had people he knew working in the military-industrial complex, and they already had the internet, as we well know, long ago. Eventually they'd give this to the public. They'd give them a new reality where they could then wean people away from direct contact with each other, live in their boxes, in their head in a sense, and they communicate to all their sock puppet friends and so on and so on. That's happened. People can hardly look at you in the eyes today. They don't want to talk to you directly. They'd rather text you from a distance. So that's been awfully successful. It's total war to create a new kind of human, which is pretty well almost here in reality. People are not smarter at all, more intelligent. They're dumber. And they also are losing the ability to reason things through. The reasoning is done for them by the state. Now, going back to Bertrand Russell, he said that, and so did Lord Galton Darwin, Charles Galton.
Alan, I've got to interrupt you again for one more break. I apologize. You're hearing, ladies and gentlemen, some of the most profound information ever from Alan Watt. We'll be back in 3 minutes. We're going to pick up our conversation here with Alan Watt, and we're talking mind control today. You're hearing all kinds of information that you're not going to hear anyplace else. And Alan, I mentioned to you earlier that we had such a positive response from you last time you were on, and already today the emails are rolling in. So I've got a couple questions that I'm going to just shotgun at you here real quick, and we'll try and get through a few of these just because people are so curious. My first question, though, is out of your entire body of work, from books to DVDs and interviews that you've done, what do you believe, where would be a good starting point for people to learn more about what's going on around them? What do you recommend as a first step for people to want to become deprogrammed? And where can people find that information?
The best place actually is to study the books on behaviorism by Skinner and others of his ilk, because they were not just talking about human behavior. They're being funded to find out how to understand human behavior and how to alter that and shape it and direct it and use it on a mass scale for the elite's purposes. And so their own books, in fact, condemn them. Very few folk read these particular books. They're easy to read, actually. And Skinner especially was very straightforward. So was Bertrand Russell, if you look at the scientific outlook and the impact of science on society. They spoke on behalf of the world groups that they were already working with to shape the cultures which we now have today. And they were doing this way back from the 1930s right through the 60s, 70s, and so on to the present time. The changes we're still going through, some of these men at the top were completely responsible for laying down the program for it, step by step, generation by generation. And we're still living through it today. Remembering culture, to change culture, and Plato talks about this, that in culture you have drama. Drama has a tremendous impact on the youth. Today it's movies. Music too, Plato said, should even be licensed because it could stir the youth to rebellion and turn against their parents, for instance, or the establishment if it was used by those who knew how to use it. He knew this because he studied under Socrates, who was actually condemned to death for trying to disrupt and deviate the youth to turn against their parents. That was the real reason Socrates was put to death. So they understood, even in ancient times, that music was highly effective as a tool to stir people's emotions, young people especially, into rebellion, and shaped and directed rebellion at that. So it's never changed. These techniques are always the same. The churches knew how to use this as well to get the opposite effect, because they built them in such a beautiful way in architecture and experimentation to get the perfect pitch and tones for certain songs and hymns that they sung, which could put you into a meditative state and a very placid state. And once you've been put into a placid state, you're under almost a hypnotic state. It's very close to sleep and awake. And you can then be programmed by the particular sermon that's put across to you. Today, they use a much more Hollywood technique in the big churches, where they use the high frequencies which affect the youth, especially very high frequencies, and the very low frequencies. That's why you get them both in popular music. And churches too today, they use all the lighting equipment, which is very similar to the strobe equipment that again Brandt and the guys who worked with Grateful Dead, who worked with the Air Force, by the way, to bring in the strobe lights along with drugs, for those who don't know this. They were given Air Force hangars to test out strobe lights with the use of drugs, bring young people and have them dance and so on, and study the effects upon them. This is all done from the top down, not from the bottom. And then you convince the youth, of course, always that the ideas are coming out of their own generation. They have no idea. It's all done by much older people upon them and put out there for them to grab. But so churches are a big part of it too. If you watch televangelists, especially,
I have to interject here, because I was a music major in school, and I'm struck by the fact that you just mentioned the music in church, because I can only imagine what it would have been like to be in a Gothic cathedral back in the day, and the first time you hear something like Palestrina, where they have separate choirs, multiple voices, it would have just been, overwhelming would be an understatement to say. Yeah. I mean, just if people haven't heard Palestrina, just do a search for him and start page and listen to some of the music and understand that this was, happening at a time when we were going from Gregorian chant, very mono, tonal, to this multiple tone, just high frequencies and low frequencies, and just majestic music and languages that, the natives really didn't speak, would have just been overwhelming. And I just wanted to point that out, that I fully understand what you're saying, and I think Palestine...
Yes, it literally created in their minds and their whole being for that time that you were as close to heaven as you could be. That was the idea. This is what heaven was like. It was beautiful, you see. And this is perfectly well understood. Knowledge of human behavior has been going on for thousands of years. It's never lost. It's the most valuable information there is. And governments down through the centuries have always acquired this and made sure they had copies of different studies across the world, right up to the present time. And today is pretty well perfected. They know exactly how we tick, how we think, how we arrive at conclusions. And in fact, most of us don't come to our own conclusions. We're guided to our conclusions with scientific technique today, yeah.
Yeah. That's why it's really, really important to do the work necessary to know who you are. Rest in peace, Alan. Can't believe that you're gone. All links are below.